For you I live, and for you I'll breathe. I just wanna please you, 'cause Lord, I love you.
Hi, and welcome to another episode from SOS Ministries, Snippets for Your Soul. And today we just want to talk about casting your cares. And we are reading from 1 Peter chapter 5, and we're reading two verses, so verse 6 and 7. 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7, I'll be reading from the King James Version. And it says, "Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you." And it's interesting sometimes because we can be so filled with fear and anxiety, and we don't always stop to ask ourselves why. Or we ask ourselves why, but the answer we get is sort of like the surface answer. And I'm speaking specifically to those of us who are believers or who profess to believe in the might and the power of God. Sometimes we struggle with anxiety. Sometimes we struggle with that worry, that fear of the what if. So maybe it is a very real situation that we're going through, and we find ourselves very anxious or very concerned, and we don't always ask why. And it's interesting because I feel like this passage is very telling. And it says, "Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due season." It says, "Cast all your cares upon him, because he cares for you." And it led me to wondering, is the reason that we get so anxious sometimes is because we feel a responsibility to fix our own issues. It seems to me like the person or the people who have the most anxiety are the people with the most responsibility. But if we say as believers that we are not responsible for ourselves, if we believe not just in our heads but in our hearts that we are the responsibility of God because we are not our own, we actually belong to God, then what does that actually do to our levels of anxiety and fear and worry? It's interesting because I feel like sometimes we are anxious because we think that certain things are our responsibility to fix. It is our burden, it is our battle. But as children of God, the battles that we find ourselves in are not ours. We may be in the battle, but we are not responsible for fighting to win. The battle is already won, and we belong to God, the God who cannot lose a fight. So it doesn't matter what the situation is. Our anxieties need to be confronted with the power of God, who is in complete control because he's sovereign, he's omnipotent, he's all powerful. There's absolutely nothing that we can find ourselves in, no situation that we find ourselves in that God isn't able to handle. So why don't we, when we get into that place where we feel anxious, humble ourselves? Recognize that, you know what, at the end of the day, we're only human. And even if we wanted to, we couldn't do it on our own. If God says that this situation is something that you're going to have to go through for the next XYZ amount of time because that is his will, then fight as we may try to, we cannot get out of it. And if we believe that deliverance and salvation belongs to God, then in due season, as the Bible says, he will exalt. So verse 6 says, in due season or in due time he may exalt you. In the right time he will lift you up out of that situation. In the right time he will send forth his deliverance. In the right time he will cease the storms and the winds and the waves. And our responsibility in that time is to trust God. You see, the issue is not whether or not God can do it. The problem is, do we trust him? Do we trust him to handle the situation? Do we believe that he's actually going to fight our battle? There's a saying, that's very popular these days, and people say, this is above my pay grade, when they get into a situation that they feel like they're not equipped to handle, or they're not in the position, they don't necessarily have the title to be able to handle. And it's the same thing with us as believers. There's some situations that we go through that are above our pay grade. We're not equipped to fight certain battles, and that's okay. We don't have to. If we trust in God, and if we trust and believe that God is able to deliver us, even when we find situations that are quote unquote above our pay grade, we can still have peace because we know and we believe that God is able. And Peter says, cast your cares upon him. Give the struggle over to God. Let him fight your battles. Let him do what only he can do in certain situations. And it's not to say that we negate our responsibilities, not to say that we don't walk in obedience, and if God says there are certain things we need to do, or certain precepts we need to follow, or certain things that we need to adhere to, that we don't do it. But we understand that our walking in obedience is what is required of us, and not necessarily all fighting this battle. Our responsibility is to trust and obey. Our responsibility is to trust the God of our salvation. Our responsibility is to trust his ability to do for us what no other power can do. Our responsibility is to obey his promptings, obey his plans, obey his voice, obey when he gives us certain strategies, obey when he says, to be still and know that he is God. We ought to obey when he says you may need to march around the walls. You need to obey. If he says you need to stretch forth the rod, you need to obey. But our responsibility is to trust and obey. Because if we think of scriptures and the way that God delivered the children of Israel, even say for example when they were escaping Egypt, and he said to Moses, when Moses and the children of Israel saw the Red Sea before them, and the mountains behind them, and I cannot imagine the level of anxiety that crept up on them, because obviously Pharaoh's army is right behind them, and there seemed to be no way of escape. So what are we going to do? But the other thing is that they weren't responsible for their escape. They were not responsible. It wasn't Moses' idea to go in and to say to the children of Israel, or to say to Pharaoh, God says to let my people go. It wasn't his idea. So it wasn't his battle. It wasn't his responsibility to plan this way of escape. It was God who ordained, who sent him forth to lead his children from captivity and into the promised land. And therefore, if God had ordained for him to do that, then it was God's responsibility to get them to the promised land. It was God's responsibility and not Moses's. It was God's responsibility to get them to a place of safety. It was God's responsibility to help them to escape from the Egyptians. So when they got to that Red Sea, and they thought there was no way of escape, they had the choice. They had to trust God. And not only did they have to trust God, but when God said something as seemingly, because I'm sure it seemed really simple, to say it nicely, when God said to Moses, stretch forth your rod. Okay, you do understand that we are standing before a sea, a huge body of water, and we're not about to swim through, and that the mountains are behind us. You do understand that, right? And God says, yeah, stretch forth your rod. Imagine if Moses didn't obey. Imagine if Moses' response in that moment was to be like, you know what, that doesn't really answer my problem in the way I think it should. So maybe we should see if there's another way for us to escape. Then the Egyptians would have overtaken them and brought them back into captivity. But because Moses chose to obey God, because he recognized that if God ordained the deliverance of the Israelites from the hand of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, then the same God who brought them thus far would see through his responsibility to get them to that promised land. Because God is not a God who does anything haphazardly. He's not a God who does anything halfway. What he started, he is well able to complete. The same God who saved you, the same God who has brought you thus far in life, didn't bring you in the midst of this battle so you can fight it on your own. We are the handmaid of God. We are his responsibility. The battles that we are in belong to God. Our responsibility is to trust and obey. Obey his voice, obey his leading, obey his direction, obey his word and his promptings, and trust and believe that God is well able to fight every battle that we may find ourselves in. It doesn't matter how big it may seem. It doesn't matter how overwhelming it may seem. Whatever battle you find yourself in, believe, trust and believe that God is able to deliver you out of it, that God is able to exalt you from that valley. So you don't have to be anxious. You can indeed cast your anxiety on God. You can indeed cast your cares upon God, because he is the one. Not by might. It is not going to be by your power. It is going to be by the Spirit of God. He is going to be the one who will fight your battles and deliver you. So why are you afraid? And this is not just a question that, I'm asking you. This is a question to ask myself too. Why are you afraid? If you believe that God is who he says he is, if you believe that God can do what he said in his word that he can do, why are you afraid? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Trust and believe that God can and will deliver you. All you have to do is trust and obey. Trust and obey when he says, just be still. Be still and know that I am God. Trust and believe when he says something that doesn't seem to even be relevant to what you're trying to ask him for. Trust and believe when he tells you to march around the wall 7 times. Trust and believe, glory be to God, when he tells you to stretch up the rod. Just trust and believe. Because the bottom line is that when we are trusting God and when we believe in our hearts and not just our head that he can and will deliver us, then we have no need to be fearful or anxious. And sometimes I fully understand that the mind sometimes work faster than the body. So in our minds we believe that God can and he will, but our body still manifests with signs of anxiety. But that's where our mouths and that's where the power that God has given us comes into play, because sometimes we have to coach our anxious or fearful heart into that place of submission, of trusting and obeying. Sometimes we have to speak the word of God over our situations and to ourselves. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves, we have to recite, we have to meditate the word and the promise of God to calm our fears and to calm our anxieties and to get our hearts to, instead of being anxious or fearful, just trusting and having peace, knowing that God can and he will. And the truth is that once we are in obedience to God, once we are walking in obedience to God and to his will and to his plan, our deliverance is absolutely sure. Once we are doing what God says to do in our situation, in this situation, in this battle, then he will deliver us. And he might choose a variety of ways to deliver us, but we can rest assured that God will deliver us. Why are you afraid? Trust in God. He will and he can. He can and he will. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. God can and will see us through and deliver us. All we have to do is trust and obey. Humble yourself. You're not God. You cannot fix it. You're not God. You cannot fix it. Humble yourself. Recognize that you are only human. Recognize that you are not your own. Recognize that you belong to God and that it is his responsibility as a loving father to take care of you. It is his responsibility. It is his pleasure to take care of us as his children. So humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God and he will exalt you. He will lift you up out of the situation in due season. Don't try to rush it. You cannot rush the deliverance. You cannot rush what God is doing. You cannot rush it. He will deliver you. He will exalt you in due season. And while you're waiting for that time of deliverance, while you're waiting for that time when he will cause the winds and the waves in your life to be still, cast your cares upon him, because he cares for you. Cast your anxieties upon God, because he cares for you and he will definitely take care of his own. God bless you. And I pray the peace of God that passes all understanding will rest, remain, and abide with you both now and forever. God bless.
Lord, I wanna hear you say, well done, well done, well done. Lord, I